Hey, I'm making a two-part video responding to a critique of Frank Turek's little four-minute video about what about rape laws in the Old Testament. And I decided to make it two parts because it's just gonna thematically sort of break into the prolegomena, sort of the stuff at the beginning and my critiques about that. And then in the second video, we'll get into a critique about the actual substance of Turek's commentary. So let's begin with a questioner, as Turek often does at one of his speaking events, asking about rape in the Bible.
One of the pushbacks I get from unbelieving family is about some of the atrocities in the Old Testament.
Yes.
Specifically, a woman having to marry her rapist or vice versa. I mean, I sort of have an answer for it, but it's sort of difficult to press in today's culture.
It's interesting language, right? She says, "Well, I have an answer to why, to explaining about marrying one's rapist. It's explain in today's culture." Because the implicitly, what that sort of suggests is it's the culture's fault. It's like the fact that we today have a problem with a person having to marry their rapist somehow means that we've gone astray. Um, what that misses, but what I think so many evangelicals miss is they seem to be almost blinded to how much moral improvement we've experienced within society and Western society in the last 200 years. And going further back than that, certainly like with the advent of religious tolerance, for example, in the 17th century, following the Peace of Westphalia, um, all sorts of changes. I like to give the example in the 18th century, in terms of our current understanding, still far from perfect, but our current development and understanding of animal rights. In the 18th century, it was, for example, common to tie up a bear at public picnics in Britain. And then people would stick dogs on the bears, which would rip the dogs would be attacked by the and vice versa, and eventually would end up in a lot of blood and dead dogs and dead bear. And that was entertainment, and nobody thought that was wrong. And today, would be horrified at that kind of thing. We're horrified at dogfighting, things like that. In the 1970s, there were ugly laws that were still widely in use with merchants, where a merchant could kick a person out of their store because they were physically, their appearance was considered to make other people uncomfortable. And of course, today that would be protected under as a protected ground in anti-discrimination laws. Um, and in the same way, there's a growing understanding about the problem of rape. And I'm going to get into some of those important nuances in these videos. The fact that our culture today has a problem with something doesn't mean it's the fault of the culture.
And then, some of the other wars and what are perceived by some as genocides and things like that. So how would you
Right.
answer
All right, let's deal with the
those
rape
concerns?
issue first, because that's a
Sure.
big one. The best book on this topic is by Paul Copan, who is a brilliant scholar, teaches at Palm Beach University. He's written a number of books. This is the book, Is God a Moral Monster? Here is what he talks about with regard to this issue. First of all, before we even address it, is the person that's bringing up this objection, is this person an atheist?
Okay, that's always Frank's go-to. Is the person an atheist? Because if they're an atheist, they're not even allowed to answer the question, according to Frank, to ask the question, according to Frank, because atheists have no morals, according to Frank.
She's more anti-God than an atheist.
So that's even worse.
Okay, no, this is for me so frustrating. When a person is quote unquote anti-God, that that should instill in you curiosity as to what's going on here. It doesn't instill curiosity for Frank. All he sees is, oh, they're even worse than they're anti-God. If a person is hostile to your Christian beliefs, you should want to know why. Is it? Is it because they just hate God, or is it because, for example, they were once belonged to a deeply abusive church? Maybe they had a pastor leader who spiritually engaged in spiritual abuse of them, or was a bully, or something else. But there's no sense of any of these questions as to where this hostility may come from. I'll tell you this, I would be much more concerned about a person who is completely apathetic and just doesn't care than a person who is hostile, because there's probably some story for that hostility, and you should have curiosity to explore what that story is, rather than simply use that as further grounds to morally impugn them and their intentions.
Sure.
Right.
Yes.
One thing you can ask her, you could just ask her, why do you think rape is wrong?
Okay. Uh, Now this is where he's going to go into this whole thing. Oh, if you're not a theist, you can't believe in objective morality, and you have no right to ask the question. So let's cut that off at the pass at the outset by first of all conceding, for the sake of argument, that atheism, let's say atheism does entail nihilism or moral relativism, which it doesn't, but let's say for the sake of argument that it did. Does it mean that the atheist can't ask the question? No, of course it doesn't. The atheist, who is in this case a moral relativist, can still say, look, I believe in moral relativism, but you don't. You believe certain things are objectively wrong, and certainly rape would be among those things. So, how do you reconcile the fact that what you believe to be God's inspired word includes passages in which a rapist is given free rein to marry the person they raped? How do you, as a Christian, reconcile that internally with your belief system? So this is simply, the question is independent of the questioner, and you can't undercut the question and its validity simply by attacking the questioner. That is pure genetic fallacy stuff, and ad hominem as well.
I mean, if there's no God,
Right.
if evolution is true and there is no God, and by the way, even if evolution is true, doesn't mean there's no God.
Right.
I could go into that now. I don't have time. But say there is no God and we're just overgrown germs.
Frank is the master of the straw man. So, on his view, if you're not a theist, the only other option to look at human beings is to think that they're, quote, overgrown germs. Now, I'm guessing that Frank wouldn't appreciate people openly strawmanning and caricaturing Christian belief and say, for example, well, if you're a Christian, then you believe that God controls everything and you're just a puppet. Oh, no, we're not just puppets. That's a caricature. That's a straw man. I would agree. But then don't go around and strawman other people's beliefs and assume that the only way that they can characterize their view of human beings is to be overgrown germs. This is a violation of something so fundamental to Christian discipleship. It's called the Golden Rule. Treat others the way you would want to be treated, and do not do to others things you would not want done to yourself. If you don't like people strawmanning and caricaturing your beliefs with incendiary labels and characterizations, then don't do it to them.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's nothing wrong with raping to propagate our genes, right?
Sure.
So, in other words, she's stealing a standard from God to say God doesn't exist.
Uh, right here, Frank does his old thing of saying if you appeal to objective morality, you're stealing from God. Now, there's a couple things here, at least, to note. The first thing is, again, and this is something I've repeated multiple times, that's flatly false. If you, for example, look at David Chalmers' survey of philosophers, it reveals that most philosophers are atheists, and most philosophers are also moral objectivists. They believe in objective moral value and obligation. And there are many sophisticated atheists who defend objective moral values and obligations. I often give the example of Eric Wielenberg because he's really made this one of his central projects of his scholarship. Another example I like to give is J.L. Schellenberg and Ronald Dworkin. When before he passed away, he wrote a great book talking about developing an atheistic religion in which you can not like understanding that in atheism you can have an objective sense of moral value and obligation. You can have a religious sensibility that is consistent with an atheistic view of the universe. So all of these assumptions that to be an atheist you have to um, accept moral relativism or nihilism is just flatly false. But the other thing to highlight here is Frank uses this term stealing from God. Now, what he's doing there is he's using what we would call a dysphemism. A euphemism is a way of saying something in a more positive light or a more gentle light than one might otherwise. So, for example, if you have to defecate, you might say, I have to go to the bathroom. and that is a euphemism for saying you have to defecate. In the same way, we have dysphemisms, and people aren't probably as familiar with that term, but we use them all the time. Let's say that you're at a restaurant, and the waitress comes over and says, "Can I steal that ketchup bottle from you?" Because she needs to give it to another table, and you say, "Sure." What she's doing there is she's using a dysphemism. She's stating it in a more negative way, stealing the bottle, when in fact she's not stealing it. Literally, she's just taking it and giving it. It's the restaurant's ketchup after all, but she's giving it to another table to use. But she uses a dysphemism. Frank here uses a dysphemism, stealing from God, when you use objective moral categories that, in his view, you don't aren't consistent with your belief system. But that's not literally stealing. It's clearly a dysphemism. Now the difference is this: that when the waitress says she's stealing the ketchup bottle, everybody understands she's not literally stealing it. It's a friendly way of sort of heightening the imposition she's making upon you. I'm stealing it. Like she's heightening the imposition, the interruption by taking the bottle away from you, which ironically has a positive rhetorical spin on it. When Frank says the atheist is stealing from God, they're not stating it using the dysphemism in a friendly, almost positive way, but rather in an exceedingly negative way, by actually imputing in some indirect sense corrupt moral intent to the atheist who is taking from God that which they have no right to take. It is just a way of further othering atheists and whoever else that he wants to attack, making them look worse and even more negative than he would otherwise portray them by saying they're stealing from God. It's just awful. So that's all I'm going to say for this opening video. In the next video, we're going to take a look at what uh, Turek says about this passage in Deuteronomy 22, which I'm going to say to you right now is, if anything, even more awful than what we've just looked at.